Hey guys, Winamede here, and welcome to the Elements of Motion Graphics Part 2, where we're going to take an in-depth look at composition. So last episode, we took a look at the elements of art, and this time we're going to take a look at how we can organize them and some principles we can use and some practical tools in order to put them together in a pleasing way. So first, we're going to go over a little bit of the theory, and then we're going to walk through 3 separate examples where we can exercise what we've learned and create some cool geometric backgrounds. So let's get started. Last week, we designed atoms, isotopes, and molecules, which were the basic building blocks of geometric motion graphics, but we didn't really explore their design significance. We can look at them from 6 perspectives and use those to inform our art. The first is line. Many of the elements we made last week were built on linear, often directional components, suggesting a way in which they could naturally move, and many of these parts serve as paths for the eye, allowing the artist to direct the viewer's attention throughout the piece. Then we have color, subdivided into brightness, hue, and saturation, or the intensity of a hue. Color is a very complex topic, and I won't really emphasize it here, but it has a lot of potential for use. In this series, we're going to be creating a color randomizing node group over a small palette, or like a basic tone and shadow mix, which you can see at the end of the previous video. Texture conveys a tactile feeling to the viewer, and we should think about how to use smooth, curved elements against sharp, jagged ones depending on the tone we want to convey. It's also important to have some consistency in texture, or else the work can become way too noisy. So I tend to stick to angular or curved elements, but not both. Values suggest light and shadows, and since we're using Blender, we can actually just use virtual lights to create virtual shadows, so we won't really be considering this one too much. Form is about the shape, dimension, and body of an element, and we've introduced several isotopic variations by altering the thickness and fill of our basic atoms, so we have that covered. And space, finally, particularly in its negative and positive parts, can be used with a line in order to really frame a piece and suggest the important and unimportant details. We can use Blender's composition guidelines to help define our use of space, as I'll explore later. So to close off the theory part, we're going to have a couple of practical tips. So you want to make sure you have a clear focal point or several in order to direct the attention of the viewer. You don't want to abuse symmetry too much. So if you divide your render directly in half, it probably won't look as good as if you added a little bit of asymmetry to it. You can vary the detail, size, and negative space throughout a render. And you should always tell a story, if you can think of one. The rule of odds states kind of that having an odd number of elements is better than having an even number of elements, mostly because an even number of elements can end up being more symmetrical, and that can be pretty unappealing. Though, of course, this is just a guideline. You don't have to have odd numbers of elements. It's just something you may want to try in case your art is looking a bit flat. You want to use a consistent shadow and reflection direction, and this usually only applies if you have a couple of lights and you're using diffuse materials, which I might be doing later, so we'll see about that. You can use leading lines to point towards the subject or focal point. For example, long bars or arrow strips that are directing the eye towards a specific point. And you can always align your elements in parallel or perpendicularly in order to create a nice effect, which is one of the things we're going to explore in one of the examples. First, for a bit of setup. Now there are 2 things that we need to adjust. First, we need to create some sort of composition overlay so we have a guide as to where to put our elements. And the way we do this is we have the camera selected, just left mouse button on it, and then you can go to this camera tab in the properties panel, hit viewport display, and then you'll see this composition guides. Open it up, and then you can select that you want. And there are a lot of options to choose from. Try not to have 2 enabled at once. I don't think that will help you. Yeah, just stick with a composition guide you think looks good. Now, in order to finely tune this, you might notice that it's kind of hard to see. So we can go into Edit, Preferences, and then Themes here. And then, unfortunately, I don't think there's a search option, but you need to go into 3D viewport, and then view overlay, and this will let you adjust the color of the composition guides as well as the camera outline. So you don't want to have it too bright and obnoxious, but sometimes it might be pretty hard to see. So you definitely want to turn it up a little bit. At least I find it's a bit hard to see on my default configuration. Now the second thing you want to do is to enable the Bool Tools add-on, which will help us make some interesting shadow effects. So we can search this up, EOOL. I have it enabled, just make sure you have it selected right here. And then you'll be able to use it by using this hotkey Ctrl-Shift-B. Alright, now to the actual implementation phase. So here's a quick way to fix your camera if it's oriented wrong. Hit Alt-G to reset it to the origin and Alt-R to reset its rotation, and then you'll see if you move it upwards on the Z-axis by grabbing it and moving it upwards by pressing Z, that it's going to be centered on the Z-axis. It will be centered on the origin. Okay, so let's create a stripy molecule first. So we can add an array modifier to a slightly elongated strip, and then we can increase the offset in order to vary the sort of density of lines. Now we can use these to create specific shapes, and you can imagine this as a cookie cutter. I suggest you leave a copy of this behind so we don't end up having so we don't have to create this array every single time, and we just use duplicates. Okay, so right now we just have a hexagon from our toolkit that we made last week, and it's just got a basic emission texture. So this will be our focal point, and I'm going to put it dead center in the image, and I'll surround it with a hexagonal ring. Again, another thing we made last week. You can make this by insetting the hexagon shape, or probably by a lot of methods. Okay, and now let's use this composition guide to figure out how to arrange our elements. So in order to create a shadow element, which will be our third and last element, we're going to imagine a cookie cutter. So we can take this hexagon, we need to extrude it up, and then make sure that these two elements are intersecting. We can hit Ctrl-Shift-B, Auto Boolean, and intersect in order to take a cutout. But you'll notice that our array is gone, so that's why we want to work with a duplicate of that array, so we don't have to recreate it every time. So again, extrude upwards, make sure they intersect, and then apply the Boolean operation, and then we have pretty much any shape we want. And now we can apply this to alter our central focal point. And now let's just arrange elements around it following that composition guideline. So we've only got 3 elements really here. We have the hexagonal ring, a solid hexagon, and a stripe hexagon. You don't need to have everything completely exactly centered on the line, because that is a bit oversymmetric, I think. And what you want to have is a bit of variation, both up and down from the line, as well as in size. So you can have a lot of different sizes, and I'd like to have them sort of fade off as you get further away from the focal point. So you can just scale it with S, and it will shrink and get a bit smaller as you move away. And it's a good idea to just alternate these elements. Don't do it too regularly, like one ring, one stripes, and then one hexagon, as that's not a great idea. Also, you can see at the intersections of the perpendicular guidelines that I have a bit more detail. Again, this has to do sort of with the rule of odds, where we can have an odd number of focal points, which is quite helpful for directing the viewer's gaze. So just arrange all of the elements along this central diagonal line. Make sure to have variation in size and texture. And there we have it. Now, in order to create the shader, We can use what we did in the last video and give it a completely random shader by using a constant color ramp connected to a randomized input. And this is pretty straightforward. The randomized input comes from the object info node, by the way. And we can always vary the position of the sliders in order to change the probability distribution of the colors. And we can always alter the colors, add more, and do whatever you like. Alright, so finally, a background piece. Let's make this a new material because we don't want to have the rest of our things copy that. And we're going to sample the background. Then we can darken it just very slightly and have it overlay the image. So this is going to be a background piece, and again we're going to try to align it in parallel, so we have all of our elements parallel, and these lines are all going to point in the same direction. We can increase the array count in order to have more of these elements, and this is a pretty easy way to make this hexagonal abstract geometric background. And I think it looks pretty cool. It's pretty easy. That only took about 5 minutes, and we have a very simple composition that we used a couple of techniques for. Okay, so for the second piece, we're going to create a more varied shape that has, or a more varied render with a couple more parts. So again, we're going to use this cutout technique, and we're going to create a sort of outlined zebra striped hexagon. And just so we can use that later. So now we're going to switch the composition guide to golden ratio so we can have a bit of a different look. And everything here is going to be perpendicular and oriented parallel to the x and y axes. Okay, so we can add another hexagonal outline to this. And I quite like this model, and you can see this quite frequently if you search for like geometric backgrounds. Basically it's just a ring and a stylized shadow, and that stylized shadow can be made of like a dot matrix or stripes. Okay, so now we can add some text. We can just use the Blender default font, which is fine, and give it a white material so we can see it. I'm going to use the word PhOton because I think this looks nice. That hexagon is basically a stylized O, and O's are very easy to use in circumstances like these. Okay, so now how do we direct the attention to this focal point? Well, we can create a couple of arrows, and we can use the array modifier like we did last time in order to do that. Make sure to swap the axis so it repeats on the x-axis rather than vertically. And we have a nice arrow stripe pointing at it. And we can also make sort of like a podium sort of shape to point on a perpendicular axis towards the hexagonal O shape. And we can create a lot of variation here. These don't actually have to be straight lines. We can turn them into trapezoids by selecting one vertex. You can hit Tab to go into edit mode, left click to select a vertex if it's on vertex mode, and press 1 if it's not on vertex mode to change it to vertex selection. And yeah, so we'll just try to orient these nicely. We can make a couple more, and we can scale them so that there's a bit of size variation here. And you can always make them a bit shorter, though it really doesn't matter too much. Alright, so now let's make a bit of a frame. So we can delete that corner vertex, and then select all of them and hit F to fill it into a triangle. So I have a right triangle here. I can rotate this 90 degrees if I want, and then I can make another frame. It's perpendicular, and you'll see that this sort of makes a square shape. The negative space sort of makes a square shape. and everything's sort of pointing. So we have these angled lines pointing downwards towards this podium shape, which points upwards towards the focal point, the word photon. And of course we can use these composition guidelines to tell us where we might want to finish off the triangles and where we want to place the majority of our pieces. And this is a pretty simple way to frame a piece. Just have all the elements sort of pointing at it. We can give this a nice color. I like this magenta, but you can go with whatever sort of color you want. I think I'll go with like a lime green right now. Okay, and again for a bit of an angled background. So remember, we can make a denser line array this time. We can increase the count, scale it up. Don't worry if it's outside the scene, it won't matter because it won't show up in the render. Make sure it's below your other objects so it doesn't draw on top of them. And then for the color, make sure it's its own material so the other things don't inherit it. And then sample the background color. Then we can make a slight variation, perhaps making it a bit brighter, and we have a nice minimalist graphic right here. One final thing you might want to do is align the diagonal to the angle of the podium shafts. I don't know what I would call them. And we can sort of align everything to that angle, this triangle included. And yeah, that's pretty much all the tweaks you'll need for this one. Okay, and for our final example, we're going to go to a more scattery design. So this will be a bit faster because I don't want this video to take too long. And there are a couple of things I just want to highlight here, but the techniques are essentially the same as they were in the previous two examples. We want to make sure to frame things, and we can make stylized shadows by using the Bool Tools add-on. So now I'm going to use a circular piece and I'll carve out a circular structure. When you do this, you want to set the origin by right-clicking, going to the Set Origin tab, and then setting the origin to center. And I'm just going to make a sort of circular outline. I haven't changed the composition guide, so they're still going to be as they are. And I'm going to make this framing piece to the side. So this is going to borrow a bit from the first example, and it's just going to be a couple of elements arranged in parallel, although with a bit of asymmetry so it doesn't look too regular. I think I'd like to call this sort of object a key because it kind of looks like one. And I like using this as sort of a framing vertical element as it's quite useful. So you'll see this a lot in some of the stuff I do. Okay, so let's make a circle stripe. A circle stylized shadow made out of stripes. You can have a couple of different variations. It doesn't have to only be made out of a dot matrix or a series of stripes. You can have multiple. So I'm just going to use a couple of arc fragments here. Here we have a 90-degree and 180-degree arc. Again, we're going to cut out some slices, and then we're going to use them as shadow pieces. You'll notice that I'm sort of arranging these pieces in the corners of the piece, just so I can have some nice framing. And I'm trying to follow the composition guide and trying to keep certain segments. So you'll see how the screen is split into 9 segments using this composition guide. So I'm going to try to keep each of the segments unique. So I'll try to fill some segments with a lot of detail, and I'll try to leave some segments with less detail. And this is just me sort of randomly putting shapes together. Again, you're probably going to have to make a lot of tweaks to what looks good. It's often not too difficult. You want to be careful of having too much symmetry, so you want to have lots of variation in size. You can have variation with the shadows, and a lot of other things. You also want to be careful of Z fighting, which is when you have two elements that are directly on top of each other. and like physically overlapping, so you want to make sure they have some offset. So if you went into side view, for example, you'd be able to see them not overlapping, one on top of the other. There's a small cross. There are a couple of ways to make a cross. This is sort of a thick cross. I can make a thinner sort of cross, and I'll do that in a moment. And again, we're just going to add a couple more rings. Alright, time for a couple more shadow elements. So we can have this triangle piece. That looks pretty cool. A dot matrix shadow for the semicircle. And we have a couple of triangles sort of situated randomly. Okay, so now we can take 4 loop cuts into any random plane, and then we can delete the corners in order to create an X or a plus sign fairly simply. Finally, I'm going to add a bottom frame by creating a sort of bullet shape. Again, not too much symmetry, so I'm going to add a bit of variation in the lengths. Okay, so now I can turn off this composition guide because it does get in the way. And I'm going to set up the background color and everything. Also, the things that I created from new materials as opposed to duplicating won't have the correct material, so I will select everything, select something with the material I want, hit Ctrl L, and then I can link the materials. Alright, so again with the random shader, this time I'm going to give it a lot of colors. So we're going to go for like a nice pink, a deep green, the sky blue color, and maybe something like a yellow. Alright, so I noticed the bottom left corner doesn't really have too much, so I will add a couple more things there, sort of randomly, again with some size variation, shadow type variation. And yeah, I will play with the background. It's good not to make it completely white, like with a hex code of 6 Fs. Rather, you want to have it slightly off white or slightly off black. That way you actually have some room to move things around. I also want to add some background elements, but instead of stripes, I can have translucent pieces by turning on alpha blend in the settings for Eevee, and then mixing that with the transparent shader and emission shader. So I'm not sure if I mentioned I was using Eevee, but this sort of thing is really great. What Eevee is really great for. Since you don't have to calculate any complex shadows, Eevee can do this much faster than Cycles can. So you have a much nicer time using Eevee. Though with transparency, you just need to remember to set the blend mode of the material to alpha hashed or alpha blend. Alright, so now we have a lot of colors, which I quite like. Instead of an emission material, we can actually try to turn this into a diffuse material, and we can add some area lights for lighting. We can turn up the metallic and turn down the roughness, and we can have a very cartoony sort of look like this. We'll just add a couple of area lights. Again, I'm making sure none of the elements overlap, so I'm going to offset them vertically. And here are just a couple of lights. You could definitely do a lot more with lights, as I haven't really explored the implications of using lighting in this video, but that will be for another time. Alright, so thank you for watching the second episode of the Elements of Motion Graphics. I promise in the next episode we're actually going to start doing the motion part of motion graphics, and we're going to work on actually animating things and figuring out how we should do that and what sort of principles we should be guided by there. If you like this video, please be sure to like and leave a subscription if you want to see more of this content. Comment if you want to see any other interesting Blender stuff, and be sure to check out my website because that's got a text summary which will be up and in the description. So thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time.